What is the state of U.S. and Middle East relations? Good evening, everyone. I'm Linda Laurel. Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. Djeredjian is an American diplomat and former ambassador to Syria and Israel who served 8 presidents from John F. Kennedy to Bill Clinton. Following his career in the U.S. Foreign Service, Djeredjian became the founding director of Rice University's Baker Institute. He is a leading expert on foreign policy and national security, as well as the vast religious, economic, and ethnic issues of the Middle East and South Asia. Throughout his career, Djeredjian has played key roles in the Arab-Israeli peace process and regional conflict resolutions. His 2008 book, Danger and Opportunity, An American Ambassador's Journey Through the Middle East, highlights his personal insights concerning U.S. policy toward the Middle East, a book he referred to as a letter to the incoming president. So tonight we ask, has the book helped guide President Obama's Middle East policy? And with events unfolding daily in Syria and Iraq, especially the ongoing threat from Sunni militant group ISIS, can the U.S. peacefully negotiate in the Middle East? This evening, we are very honored to welcome esteemed diplomat and former U.S. Ambassador Djeredjian. And as always, leading our discussion, our hosts, David Jones and Gary Polland.
Well, David, we're certainly honored to have such a distinguished guest tonight. And I want to start out, Ambassador, by talking about what's on the news every day, and that's the disaster in Iraq. How did we get here, and what do we do about it?
Well, how we got here depends on how far back you want to go into history. But as I outlined in my book, to really understand the conflicts we're having in the Middle East, you really have to at least go back to the creation of the modern Middle East after World War I, when the English, specifically the English and the French colonialists, divided up much of the Arab world as we know it according to their imperialist designs. And this is the famous Sykes-Picot Agreements, 1916, 1922. And the reason I mention that, because to many of our viewers it may seem totally irrelevant, but it's so relevant because the decisions that they made at that time by drawing lines and creating borders and boundaries that many times crossed ethnic, sectarian communities, they created, they planted the seeds to some of the conflicts that we're seeing that we call sectarian conflicts between Shia, Sunni, Christian, Muslim, Druze, Kurds, in the Middle East. So to understand where we're at, you really have to go back to that period, because they created a Greater Lebanon, cutting it out of Syria. They created Iraq. They drew the borders of Iraq. They created Iraq as a country and put Faisal in as king. The partition of Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab conflict. They created the state of Transjordan, as it was called at the time, out of whole cloth to award the Emir Abdullah because they helped the British against the Ottomans during World War I, and on and on. I mean, you could even go further east and the Durand line in Afghanistan, where they drew this line in the mountains, and they cut the Pashtun nation in half, and we have the Taliban issue now. So I think it's important for our viewers to understand that there is a 100-year-old history at least here. But more relevant in terms of the current situation, there's no question that our invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the toppling of Saddam Hussein, who was a brutal dictator, and what we did during the occupation has led to a great deal of the instability that we see in Iraq today, because one of the mistakes, in my view, that we made, and we pointed this out before we went in at the Baker Institute in a study with the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. We pointed out that if we do go in, it's important that we put enough troops on the ground to restore law and order, because when you overthrow an autocratic leader in the Arab world, you got to restore law and order, or else violence will prevail. Well, that's exactly what happened. Is this the report that was titled "Why They Hate Us" by any chance? That published in 2003. No, this is the guidelines for post-conflict Iraq. This is a previous report, and they didn't do that. They won the war. I mean, the Bush 43 administration brilliantly conducted the war, but the occupation, which they call the liberation, was very faulty. When they made the decision to dismantle the Iraqi armed forces, That was a big mistake because you could get rid of the goons at the top who had blood on their hands or were close to Saddam Hussein, but you needed a security force. And when you sent those young soldiers home with their weapons and the keys to the arms depots, that later turned out to be part of the Sunni insurgency against us. And the other big mistake they made was to de-Ba'athify. The Ba'ath Party in Iraq is equivalent to what we had in Tammany Hall in the 20s. I mean, if you joined the Ba'ath Party, which was the either Saddam Hussein's party in Iraq and Hafez al-Assad's party, Ba'ath Party in Syria, you were guaranteed for a good job for your children, education, and all that. So de-Ba'athifying meant that you virtually marginalize your civil service and your technocrats, the people who keep the electricity grids going, the water running, the sanitation systems. So we made all these ex cathedra decisions that really tore the Iraqi system asunder. And I really don't think it's recovered from that to this day. So when you look at what's happening today, you have, which is incredible because when you think that we spend so much blood and treasure in Iraq, 10 years, 4,600 odd American soldiers who got killed, at least 100-odd thousand Iraqis, the amount of treasure, taxpayers' treasure, you know, which I see estimates of $1 trillion. I can't put a figure on it, but it's
I've seen 4.
Yeah, it's
and of
huge.
course, we're still spending money because of our veterans, too.
And we're exactly, and just think of the picture that we went in there, we spent all this blood and treasure, and then in recent months, in Fallujah and Ramadi, where our Marines fought and were killed, the black flag of ISIS, this Islamic radical group, is flying, and you've just got to ask yourself, what was it all for?
When did things change? Because you worked for George Herbert Walker Bush, James Baker, and you said in your book that that administration and the one that followed believed that Islam was not an ism that needed to be destroyed or fought with. And yet there are those who think of West versus Islam in a clash of civilization sense, which you disagree with. Did the Bush 43 organization see it more as this clash of civilizations, do you think?
I thought they saw it more in terms of regime change in the Middle East, getting rid of dictators and promoting democracy. The Islamic element was there, but I don't think it was the overwhelming element in their calculus. But I agree with you. That's a very important issue that I made a speech in 1992 when I was Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East under the Bush 41 administration and Secretary Baker, the so-called Meridian House speech, which I basically said after the fall of communism and our defeat of the Soviet Union, people and scholars and political groups were going around saying, well, who's the next enemy? And I saw a very troubling trend that, you know, we're going to adopt maybe Sam Huntington's thesis of the clash of civilizations and really distorting some of his ideas. But fundamentally, I said, the next enemy, the next ism the United States is going to face after we defeated fascism in World War II and communism in the Cold War is not a world religion, a culture like Islam, but the next ism the United States is going to confront is extremism and terrorism of either a secular or religious cloth. And that really turned out to be the case, because this speech was done in 1992, and remember the first World Trade Center bombing was in 1993 in New York, and then of course 9/11. So we thought we put together, and I think we did put together, a coherent strategic policy approach in identifying what the real challenges were for our national security interests without making the critical mistake of creating false enemies. In the Muslim world, there's something like, I don't know how many, 1.4, 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. 85% of those Muslims are Sunnis, 15% are Shia, because we're talking about the big Sunni-Shia rift here. But the vast majority of Muslims practice their religion in peaceful ways. But there is a very militant minority, which we call the Islamic radicals, and which are manifesting themselves not only in Al-Qaeda, that of course attacked us on our homeland, but now ISIS, which is an entirely new phenomenon and a very dangerous one.
Aren't they like an offshoot of Al-Qaeda?
Well, it originally, yeah, exactly. It is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, but it's distinctly different than Al-Qaeda because it has an international agenda. It is extremely well organized. They have an excellent accounting department that tallies up all the figures of the money they've extorted through kidnapping, seizing of arms, raiding banks. You know, in Mosul they came out with almost $500 million worth of currency. They actually account for the money that they pay to martyrs' families, suicide bombers. They pay. They are extremely well organized. They have a strategy and a plan to establish an Islamic caliphate, going back to the early origins of Islam and establishing a caliphate under Sharia law from at least Iraq all the way to the Mediterranean, at least.
Yeah.
Ambassador, I believe in your book, and I know in your book, you met with I think he's called the president of Syria, Mr. Assad, who sort of gave you a lecture about how it is that the United States really shouldn't be trying to impose democratic ideas in the Middle East, that was a very dangerous course for us to be following. It seems to me like that if you look at polling data, the Muslim world has caught on to the sort of the hypocrisy of our, quote, promotion of democracies, given that we don't seem to respect the decisions of the Egyptians. And with the Egyptian Brotherhood victory, we're now with the coup people. We ignored the Hamas election in Palestine. When did this kick in? No, we need to promote democracy over there.
Well, that again goes back. You go back to World War I, Woodrow Wilson, and the promotion of self-determination and democracy in the world. I mean, if you look at contemporary American foreign policy, this is a simplification, but there are two basic trends that tug against each other or with each other, depending on what the issues are. And that's on one hand is the Woodrow Wilson School of promoting democracy and self-determination, which is a very strong pillar of American foreign policy. And the other very strong pillar is national security interests, which is a very brutal clinical look at what are our national security interests, and that's what we should be promoting. And not so much democracy or other issues, but what are the national security interests that eliminate the threats against the United States.
Such as peace with Egypt, such as a peace treaty with Egyptians and the Israelis.
Right, and you know, a man like Kissinger really personified the national security school of thought, and others, of course. And what you're talking about, the Woodrow Wilson School, has certainly had its proponents, including Jimmy Carter and others. I mean, but to various extents. But the main thing is that the president of Syria, when I was ambassador to Syria, was Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current president, who's brutalizing his own people. But Hafez al-Assad was again a total autocrat, a brutal dictator also, but he was a strategist. He was a strategic thinker. And we were able, under the Bush 41 and Secretary Baker, we were able to do a lot of business with him because it's true, we did not push forward in any real strong way the democracy agenda in Syria, but what we did push was getting Syria to help end the brutal civil war in Lebanon, in which Syria had a lot of influence in, did that. Getting U.S. hostages out of Beirut, that the Iranian Hezbollah, and we used the Syrians as our conduit to the Iranians, to Hezbollah. No negotiations in terms of money or deals made, but just political influence and political. We got Hafez al-Assad to join Desert Storm Coalition, which was quite a breakthrough because the relationships between the United States and Syria have been typically adversarial, and here we have this this Arab nationalist, pan-Arab leader joining a U.S.-led coalition. Of course, Saddam Hussein was one of his biggest rivals in the Middle East, but it was huge that he would join a U.S.-led coalition politically and militarily, and Bush and Baker weighed in on that in a very decisive way.
I think you made some arguments for protection of Syrian Jews as well.
Right, and I personally negotiated with Assad and on the freedom of travel of Syrian Jews, because it was a humanitarian, this was one humanitarian issue that we did deal with. And I basically asked the fundamental question, why is it that in your country, Mr. President, the Syrian Jews don't have the same right of travel that Syrian Muslims, the Syrian Christians, the Syrian Druze have? And he relegated me to one of his intelligence chiefs, and I was getting nowhere for a year. And I went back to him and I said, we're getting nowhere. Is there someone I can deal with that you have confidence in? That? And so he did give me his Minister of State for Foreign Affairs. It took another year, but we started getting the Syrian Jews out, and eventually got them all out. And it was humorous at one point, because he said, you know, you're promising me that they're going to go to the United States. I said, yes, they're going to Brooklyn. And because there's a large American Syrian Jewish community there. And I'll remember, I put this in my book, he said, what is this place you call Brooklyn? And he said, it has nothing to do with Israel, does it? I said, no, it has nothing to do with Israel. But we got a lot done. And then the crowning achievement was really the getting the Syrians to agree to direct face-to-face negotiations with Israel. When I first got to Damascus in 1988, Assad would not even mention the word Israel. He would refer to Israel as a Zionist entity. By the time we left negotiating with him, not only was he calling it Israel, but we were talking about the difference between Likud, Meretz, Labor Party. I mean, it was an evolution, because we were doing so many things together that we were able to educate him on the dynamics of Israel, because we were getting him close to negotiating with them.
Had you educated the Israelis about the letter that George Bush, that you delivered to Mr. Assad, where he's inviting Assad to be a part of peace talks with Israel, with the UN resolutions and trading land for peace, where there is Israelis in on and using the 1967 borders as well as far as the new configuration of what that peace would look like, or was this something that they didn't quite buy into yet?
No, I think, you know, Secretary Baker very deftly provided letters of assurance to each one of the parties, separate, but we briefed all the parties on the content. We didn't give them the letters, but this, again, the deftness of the diplomacy at the time. So the Israelis had a letter of assurance from the Secretary of State on what the parameters of the negotiations were going to be, and what we were going to be telling the other parties, and what we expected Israel in this case to do. So they were informed, but again, here's the deftness of the diplomacy at the time. Even before we pushed Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, President Bush and Baker realized that there was an opportunity in this crisis that we could exploit, and that would be, after having built this incredible international coalition, an Arab coalition, against Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, we would then translate that into a major initiative on Arab-Israeli peace. And that turned out to be culmination of the Madrid Peace Conference, which is still the overarching framework for any future negotiations between
part of what
Israel.
Part of what you mentioned and why things you had some success was trust, that you could trust who was behind. I want to move back.
Sure.
I want to move back to where we are today.
Sure.
Can allies of the United States trust the word of Barack Obama?
Well, that's a very sensitive question, but I think the only answer I can give to that is that there's a lot of doubts in the Middle East as to where the United States stands on these critical issues. And in my recent trips to the Arab Gulf nations, and I go frequently, not infrequently, to Israel and Palestine, and the question is, what is American foreign policy? There's a question mark in their minds as to exactly what American foreign policy is, and what the position of the United States is, and what the position of the president is. So there is a question mark out there, and of course that's not good, because the United States, despite all of our problems, we remain the preeminent power in the world, and of course we're the one sole actor that can act decisively militarily in the world, as we see in these days. So yes, it's an issue.
We have drones, though, rather than soldiers, and I don't know that Barack Obama is not actually should be feared as a result of his drone usage of killing people. There's a bipartisan panel report that came out today, which says that, made up of former Pentagon and CIA representatives, that we are on a slippery slope to perpetual war with the use of drones, and like, what's going to keep Russia from doing it in Ukraine under the current rationale for our use of drones in targeted killings. Right. These are very scary times.
Right. You know, there's no safe use of military might, and that applies to drones, because it could have unintended consequences, as we've seen in civilian deaths. But again, the issue is it can come back to haunt you, as you mentioned. You know, how about if other powers start using drones and we become targeted? American
and the Iranians are using drones
and the
flying
Iranians,
over Baghdad
right.
today.
So it's not a fail-safe option. It's simply not a fail-safe option alone. But again, in terms of President Obama has used drones very assertively and aggressively against terrorist targets, and I have no problem with that in terms of Al-Qaeda, especially in Waziristan and in the borders of Pakistan and Afghanistan. I think that's a legitimate use of drones against terrorist targets. And he made a very brave decision in the assassination of Osama bin Laden, because that could have failed very easily and been a disaster. So he did act decisively, if you will, in paramilitary and military terms on those two things. But fundamentally, I think the use of military power as the backdrop to the exercise of American diplomacy is something that I have not seen skillfully applied in recent years, and that is a problem. And we're seeing that in Iraq today, because we should have had a status of forces of agreement signed, so that we would have had an effective contingent of American personnel in Baghdad and in the country to be able to help the Iraqi military. And now the president is in a position where he was elected on the basis that he was going to get us out of the war in Iraq, and he did. He lived up to his campaign promise in 2011. But now here he is in a position where he's reinserting 300 advisors into Iraq. And again, I hope this is not the case, but there's always these mission creep. So it's a very untidy situation. And down the line, we have the situation in Afghanistan next year.
With the same plan, which is pull all the U.S. troops out with a no status of force agreement, or probably won't have one.
With the hope that the next president will sign one.
That's
the
true.
Next president of Afghanistan will sign one. But again, one of the problems any American president has, whether you're Democrat or Republican, is frankly the very weak reads of local leadership that we have to deal with in these countries. I mean, if you look at Maliki to me is a failed national leader in Iraq. He's turned out to be much more of a Shiite sectarian leader than he has as the prime minister.
He arrested his Sunni vice president, for God's sakes.
He did that.
I mean, no wonder the people are mad.
Yeah, and when you become prime minister, or you become president of a country, overnight you become responsible for that country, not just your political party or partisan or your ethnicity or your sectarian group. You see this with real leaders. You see this all over the world. When they assume these positions, they become national leaders. But Maliki has not, and we have a problem with Karzai for many reasons in Afghanistan. So one of the problems that's systemic in the conduct of U.S. policy in the Middle East is that we have very weak leaders that we can lean on, and that that impacts our policy.
Of course, you also have to lean, which in this case, President Obama did not lean on Maliki. He let him basically do what he wanted because he wanted the story of Iraq off the headlines so he could keep his campaign promise. And now 3 years later, we see what happens.
Yeah, it's a bit of a reversal of fortunes in Iraq. Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's been a great pleasure to have you on today.
We could have a mini-series with the Ambassador.
I think we should.
Linda, because he knows so much.
I wish we had more time. I truly do. We'll have to have you back soon. Thank you so much, Ambassador. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
And
so
remember, you can catch Red, White, and Blue every Friday at 7:30 p.m. right here on TV8, and again Saturdays at 6:30 p.m. We also invite you to visit us online and send us your comments. We want to hear what you are saying about the issues that affect Houston. You can submit your comments at houstonpublicmedia.org or on Facebook. And while you're there, don't forget to like us. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again next week. Good night.